All right, looks like the court is taking a quick break. We understand this could be about 15 minutes long, so during that break, Katie and I will sort of take you back to day 2 of this trial, the Brendan Banfield murder trial. Day 2 was very eventful. I mean, things moved very quickly. It started at 10 a.m. as it does every day until Thursday. And immediately going into it, about 30 minutes in, they called up the first witness. And we heard from, of course, Juliana later in the day, but we also heard from a couple of officers responding to the scene that day and the medical examiner and records, the woman who maintains the 911 records.
And we also saw, the body camera footage of Juliana at the home. We saw the body camera footage of the officers taking the little girl out of the home. We also heard the 911 audio, those 3 calls, the call initially where Juliana doesn't say anything. And when you hear her testifying, she mentions that moment and she tells the jury that she made that call because Christine had yelled to her, "Juliana, call 911." And this is after Brenden had allegedly shot Joseph Ryan. So she made that call and she told the jury that she looked over and she made that call because Christine told her to, and Brenden went like this. So that's why she hung up. And she also confirmed that that awful sound you heard in the background was likely Joseph Ryan. And then that second call, about 15 minutes later, that's when she started speaking to the dispatchers.
She did testify that Christine, so during Juliana's testimony, she said that Brenden planned the scenario for another man to break into the home, tie Christine, harm her, rape her, and then Brenden would come in and look as if he is the hero. That is what she testified in court yesterday. She testified that Christine yelled he had a knife, that Joseph Ryan had a knife.
Which he did.
So he shot him. So when I say he, Brenden shot Joseph and then got on top of Christine and stabbed her. Now, referencing what you just mentioned, that Juliana then shot Joseph was because she was crouched on the ground, afraid, and saw him move and shot him.
And she talked about that a lot,
unfolded in court yesterday. I mean, we really got to some of the meat. Overall, I would say, Katie, I don't know what you thought, but the courtroom seemed very stoic. But we did see moments of emotion, especially when Brenden looked like he was visibly upset or saddened.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that happening yesterday during the 911 calls, but we also saw him intently watching Juliana as she was testifying, especially when she was talking about the details of what she says she saw unfolding inside of that master bedroom that morning, which was obviously extremely graphic. So again, we do want to warn you that a lot of what we're talking about and what you're seeing is graphic in nature. But yeah, she talked a lot about that, and she said the reason she pulled the trigger on Joseph Ryan is because he started moving, and she yelled to Brenden that he's moving, and then she shot him. And the medical examiner testified that that was likely the fatal shot. But she also talked about how Brenden was still on top of Christine and still stabbing her. So really tough stuff to
details. I do want to mention this from day 2, which I think is very critical. And I know you spoke to Frank, our legal analyst, about this. The defense, John Carroll, Brendan's attorney, focused on the number of Fairfax County officers that responded to the scene that day, and they were in and out of the crime scene, who is left still in this unit, the detectives, and also the officer who accompanied Brenden to the hospital that Christine was taken to. She said, we learned that Brenden was allowed to wash the blood off of his hands at the hospital.
And that was a big conversation. He asked the officer, why did you let him wash his hands? And kind of alluded to maybe the officer shouldn't have let him wash his hands. And the officer said, I felt bad for him. He had just found out that his wife had died. He had just been informed by the hospital chaplain that his wife didn't make it. She was rushed to the hospital. She was still breathing, as you hear in that body camera footage. But she gets to the hospital and they do pronounce her deceased. And he says, I felt bad. I was being empathetic. I thought I was being empathetic in that moment. And the attorneys, they asked, hey, did anyone tell you you should have swabbed his hands? And he said, no, they didn't tell me that. So he thought he was being kind to Brendan Banfield in that moment.
And finally, the evidence presented in court yesterday included a blood-soaked gun, a knife, the knife that Joseph Ryan brought to the home because he thought in his mind that he was going to be part of a sex fantasy or fulfilling a sex fantasy. And all of that is sealed evidence. We did not get to see it. Just the jury, along with whoever was on the stand, got to see that. So now here we are, day 3. Court started right away on time at 10 a.m. And already we wasted no time. They dived right into having Juliana back on the stand. Although, let me back up. She did take the stand for the final moment of the courtroom hearing. For nearly 2 hours,
yeah,
she was sitting there.
The stand around, what, 3:15, I believe, she took the stand, and they pushed her pretty intensely, and they continued to speak to her until 5 o'clock yesterday. But then we saw the prosecution continue that conversation with Juliana today until around 10:15. So quite a bit of time was spent with Juliana, and, you know, I do intend to ask Frank Salvedo, our legal analyst, about that, because we talked at length about how he didn't expect Juliana to take the stand yesterday. I don't think anyone did.
Because she is the key witness.
Right. And why would you put your key witness on day 1 or day 2 technically, but day 1 of opening statements and all these witnesses? And so that was pretty interesting to see. So I am curious to see how he reacts to that. But she talked at length about how the relationship started with Brenden. She told the jury that, you know, she came to the Banfield home in, I believe, August or October of 2021.
October 2021 is when she first moved into this home in Brenden.
And she said that their relationship became physical in nature, hers and Brendan's, in August of 2022.
Now that's just 10 months. Right? If I'm doing the math correctly, quickly, that's 10 months this relationship evolved. And then October of 2022, so that's just several months later, a few months later, they have the first talk of getting rid of Christine, his wife.
Yeah, and she makes a point to say Brenden told her that it was his elaborate plan to get rid of his wife. And I believe they had this conversation while on a trip in New York, but she even makes a point to say that she thought he was joking. She hadn't taken this relationship that serious up until this moment. She thought he was joking. And that plan, she says, sort of escalated in January of the following year when he made that profile, according to her. They made this profile on a fetish website called FetLife. And she goes into detail about how they used Christine's laptop to make the website. But let's go back a little bit to that conversation in October. You know, she was asked, why didn't he just get a divorce if he didn't want to be with his wife? And she said divorce was not an option because of money and because he didn't want to lose custody of his little girl.
Right, exactly. And she was 21 years old at the time. If you look at the timeline, that is what really shook me up, because this is fast moving. She moves in October 21. 10 months later, the relationship starts. 2 months later, now they're talking about getting rid of his wife, or he is talking about getting rid of his wife, saying divorce is not an option. And for whatever reason, Juliana went along with this scenario that he created. And, you know, in February 2023, the killings occur on the morning of February 24th. Really chilling details. Today, Juliana took the stand. Prosecution finished up with their questioning. They went over sort of the details of this plea agreement that she took. It seemed pretty much, for me, I didn't really get a lot more today, other than the fact that we learned Brendan's mom, Tess, moved into this home at some point, and she also was a facilitator for Juliana, right? She facilitated the calls that she could make back home to Brazil to her family, and also financially.
Yeah, and I think that was incredibly interesting. It does look like we have some activity in the courtroom happening right now. But we'll continue to talk until we find out. We are expecting them to remain on a break for a little bit. But one of the other interesting things, Annie, that I remember taking away from this is that she moved back into the home after the murders happened. So she moved back into the home with Brenden, and they made a point to ask her where she stayed initially, because, you know, we saw those photos on the nightstand in the master bedroom of Brenden and Juliana, you know, previously during some of the releases of information through this process. But she didn't initially move into that master bedroom. She says it was a little bit before she moved in. She initially went back to her bedroom in the home, which was still on the same floor as the little girl in the master bedroom. But then obviously they moved into that bedroom together, and she says that on the stand. So really interesting stuff to see their relationship continue even past that crime that occurred.
Right. And today, John Carroll, Brendan's attorney, focused on first the plan, how they came up with this plan. Going back to Christine's laptop, because Christine's laptop was how they communicated with Joseph Ryan, right? So he peppered her with questions about who was the one who obtained the laptop, at what points were you able to get the laptop, and who created this account on the fetish website, who did the typing. I mean, really peppering her with very specific questions. For me, what I got out of that was she did not remember who got a hold of Christine's laptop at any moment, right? And we did learn, though, that Brenden did the typing according to Juliana, and that he was the one who created the account, and they came up with, she didn't remember who came up with the username for this account.
She didn't seem to remember little details, and I think we'll see why he was
choosing. Which I think is interesting.
Right, and I think we'll find out later why he was bringing such specific questions to the table and asking her such specific details. But he also asked her, obviously, about the conversation of where Christine was during all this. Where was Christine when you guys were doing this and when you took the laptop?
And for viewers who may not know, Christine was a pediatric nurse here locally, and so she carried her laptop to work, brought it home. I mean, he was asking, did you grab it when it was set aside in the family room? Or
yeah, and I can add that yesterday she said that when Christine would come home, she would leave her backpack with the laptop inside by the door, which is how she says they were able to access it. But I do find it very interesting
the motive behind that.
And they only would access the laptop when Christine was home because she took her laptop with her, according to Juliana.
He also spent a great length of time on these letters. And I know we were trying to keep up with the dates, but I think it's clear she wrote multiple letters daily.
A lot of them. Yeah, I mean, at points.
To Brenden from jail after she was arrested, because Juliana was the first person to be arrested, and her arrest was in October of 2023. So February is when the killings occurred. Several months later in October, Juliana arrested, and she was the first to be arrested and then pled guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter.
And remember that when she was initially arrested, she was charged with murder. And Brenden was not arrested until almost a full year later. So there's a long period of time
where
between
these letters were
and
going back and forth.
Just to be clear here, these letters start almost immediately after she's arrested. And at first, if we want to go through some of the letters, at first she's talking to Brenden and she's writing that she's hurt, she doesn't want to be there, she doesn't want to feel this way. She's explaining that she feels tortured, and that she says, I thought this really stood out. She said, "I love you more than anything." And I think that was the first time we really heard her say, "I loved him." So I thought that was interesting.
For me, as they went through the timeline of these letters from Juliana to Brenden, we never heard the rebuttal. We never heard what Brenden wrote back to Juliana, but it started off with, "I love you," a very softer tone. "I can't do this without you," this, and then it progressed into
anxiety,
pain, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts. It became more and more intense, and then it escalated to, "Why am I doing this? I didn't do it. Why am I going to be facing life in prison if I'm not the one who did it?" Right? So the progression of these letters and the tone is interesting.
Yeah, there's one of the letters where she says, "I'm not willing to spend life in prison for something I didn't do." And I thought that was very powerful. But, those letters also escalate to the part where she starts complaining about her attorney. And that's kind of where we left off, where he was bringing up, were you frustrated with your attorney? What was your feeling about your attorney? And he's really pushing her and bringing out these letters where she mentions her attorney specifically and what frustrations she had with him.
Yeah, and before we toss back into this courtroom, just piggybacking off of that, I'm curious to hear what Frank has to say about that specifically, because when John Carroll, Brendan's attorney, asked about one of the lines in this letter where she expressed frustration about her attorney, saying, "I can't believe I'm even paying for this attorney when he's not doing his job," John Carroll specifically followed up with the question, "Well, were you paying for the attorney? Are you paying for an attorney?" And she replied, "No." So I don't know how that plays into this, because he found a moment to follow up with that. And does it hurt her credibility to the jury? Who knows, right? So I'm curious about what Frank has to say. Let's take you live back inside the courtroom here at Fairfax County Courthouse, where they are resuming the proceeding.